Lesson 3, American History, 1800 through the Civil War. This lesson is about American history from the end of the Revolutionary War through the Civil War, and explains some of the causes and results of that terrible conflict. The lesson is divided into 3 sections. 1800 through the Civil War, Section 1. We will now begin the first section of Lesson 3. The 1800s was a time of great change, growth, and turmoil in the United States. In the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution created great social and economic changes in the country. The United States also began rapidly expanding west and fought its first international wars. At the same time, the issue of slavery was dividing the nation and resulted in a terrible civil war. Europeans came to America in search of freedom, but at the same time, tens of thousands of people from Africa were brought here and forced to work without pay or rights of any kind. These people were called slaves. By the end of the colonial period, over 300,000 Africans had been brought to America as slaves. At the time, approximately 40,000 slaves lived in the northern states, the rest lived in the southern states. By 1850, there were 3.2 million enslaved people in the United States. This advertisement for a slave sale was placed in a Charleston, South Carolina newspaper in 1760. The southern states always had more slaves than the northern states because the two regions had very different economies. Tobacco and cotton were the main export crops in the southern states, while manufacturing became more important in the north. This made slaves less desirable in the northern states. In contrast, both tobacco and cotton required a lot of labor to grow and harvest. In the colonial period, cotton was particularly expensive because the plant was difficult to process. Before cotton could be made into cloth, many seeds needed to be removed from the fibers by hand. The process was so slow that one person could clean only 1 pound of cotton a day. However, that situation would soon change. In the 1700s and 1800s, there was an industrial revolution in Europe and North America. This was a time of great advances in farming, manufacturing, transportation, and technology in general. For example, in 1793, a man named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a machine that quickly removes the seeds from cotton. The cotton gin would become one of the most significant inventions in American history. It dramatically transformed the Southern economy and society and helped push the nation into civil war. This is a cotton gin at the Eli Whitney Museum in Hamden, Connecticut. What made the cotton gin so significant is that with it, one person could now clean 50 pounds of cotton a day instead of 1 pound. This changed Southern society in 2 important ways. First, cotton quickly became the main crop. Second, even though it was now much easier to clean cotton, so much more cotton was grown that the demand for slaves actually increased. In 1790, there were 700,000 slaves in the South. By 1850, there were 3.2 million. Congress had banned the importation of slaves to the United States in 1807, but the number of slaves in the country actually continued to grow because when a slave had a baby, that baby became a slave as well. These factors meant that by the early 1800s, the American South had in essence become a slave society. Slavery was already an issue when the Constitution was being debated in 1787. About half of the Founding Fathers and other delegates to the Constitutional Convention owned slaves. While some believed slavery was wrong and should be abolished, the Southern states would not accept the new Constitution unless slavery remained legal. Even so, by 1804, slavery had been outlawed in the 8 northern states. While these laws often didn't immediately free northern slaves, they created a clear division between free states and slave states. This divide then continued to grow as new territories were added to the United States. With each new territory and state, the question of slavery created yet another political crisis. After the Revolutionary War, the United States began expanding west more quickly. This expansion was greatly encouraged after 1803. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, bought Louisiana from France. The Louisiana Territory doubled the size of the United States, and thousands of settlers quickly moved into the territory in search of land and economic opportunity. The westward movement of settlers and the expansionist policies of the U.S. government would later result in the Mexican-American War. The peace treaty that ended the Mexican-American War forced Mexico to cede Texas and sell the rest of its northern territories to the United States. As can be seen on the map, the United States now stretched across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west. In 1853, the Gadsden Purchase added more Mexican territory to the United States and created the border we now have today. From east to west, the 4 U.S. states that border Mexico are Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. The Mexican-American War will be explained in more detail in a later lesson. This is the end of Section 1. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 60. What group of people was taken to America and sold as slaves? Africans. Africans, or people from Africa, were taken to America and sold as slaves. Question 71. What territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? Louisiana. The United States bought Louisiana, or the Louisiana Territory, from France in 1803. Question 89. What ocean is on the west coast of the United States? The Pacific. The Pacific Ocean is on the west coast of the United States. Question 90. What ocean is on the east coast of the United States? The Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean is on the east coast of the United States. Question 93. Name one state that borders Mexico. Texas. Texas is one state that borders Mexico. The 4 states that border Mexico are California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. 1800 through the Civil War, Section 2. We will now begin the second section of Lesson 3. People who wanted to end slavery were known as abolitionists. As slavery became more important in the South, anti-slavery feeling grew, both in the North and in parts of the South. For example, in 1827, there were 130 abolitionist organizations in the United States. By 1838, there were 1,300 groups with 109,000 members. That same year, 2 million people signed anti-slavery petitions. 2 early issues between the free and slave states were the Underground Railroad and the Fugitive Slave Acts. The Underground Railroad was a series of safe routes and locations that abolitionists used to help tens of thousands of slaves escape to free states and territories, as well as Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean. However, slaves were considered property, and the U.S. Constitution contained a clause requiring escaped slaves to be returned to their owner. However, Many northern states refused to do this, and some even wrote laws protecting escaped slaves. In response, Congress passed Fugitive Slave Acts in 1793 and again in 1850. These acts gave slave owners greater powers to reclaim their slaves and created punishments for anyone assisting an escaped slave. As mentioned earlier, as the U.S. expanded west, there were many arguments about whether to allow slaves in the new territories and states. At first, compromises were attempted. For example, after Louisiana was purchased in 1803, settlers were only allowed to bring slaves they already owned. New slaves could not be brought in later. Then, in 1820, the Missouri Compromise made Missouri and Arkansas slave states, but prohibited slavery in the northern half of Louisiana. Later, during the Mexican-American War, the U.S. Senate refused to ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. That angered abolitionists and, 30 years later, led to the Compromise of 1850. This compromise created the second and stronger Fugitive Slave Act and made California a free state, but allowed New Mexico and Utah to decide if they wanted slavery or not. Many Americans were particularly angered by the Compromise of 1850 and the new Fugitive Slave Act. These new laws also inspired a Connecticut abolitionist named Harriet Beecher Stowe to write a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. In this book, Stowe describes the terrible conditions slaves lived under and showed how even children were sold as slaves. Slave owners said the book was untrue, but Uncle Tom's Cabin quickly became a bestseller in the United States and Great Britain, and turned many people against slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe's house in Hartford is now a museum. Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois was one of the most influential supporters of the Compromise of 1850. He believed slavery was a states' rights issue, and therefore each state should determine whether or not it would allow slavery. 4 years later, Douglas created another compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which ended the Missouri Compromise. Instead, it divided the Louisiana Territory into two parts, Kansas and Nebraska. As with some previous compromises, each territory would vote to decide whether to be a free state or a slave state. Not surprisingly, the Kansas-Nebraska Act greatly angered abolitionists, but it also split the country's two major political parties. After the act was passed, the Whig Party collapsed, and abolitionist Democrats left the pro-slavery Democratic Party. Many abolitionist politicians then joined a new political party, the Abolitionist Republican Party, which had been created in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Since this major change in the political parties of the 1850s, the Democratic and Republican parties have remained the two major political parties in the United States. So, by the 1850s, slavery had become the most serious issue in the United States. Compromises were not working, and Southern states were openly talking about leaving the Union. In 1858, during the Senate election in Illinois, an unknown Republican lawyer named Abraham Lincoln had 7 debates with his Democratic opponent, Stephen Douglas. The main topic was slavery. Lincoln believed slavery was dividing and destroying the nation and opposed allowing slavery in any new territories. Douglas, on the other hand, continued to argue that slavery was a matter of states' rights and therefore was not a concern for the federal government. Lincoln lost the election, but the debates received national attention and made Lincoln into a major political figure. In fact, the debates made Lincoln so famous that in 1860 he was chosen as the Republican presidential candidate. That same year, Lincoln defeated Stephen Douglas and 2 other candidates to win the presidential election, despite losing in every Southern state. Since Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, was anti-slavery, Southern states began leaving the Union even before Lincoln began his presidency. Within a few months, 7 states had left and elected their own president. Eventually, 11 Southern states would form a new country called the Confederate States of America. On the map, the yellow states are the border states. Border states were slave states that chose to remain in the Union. In April 1861, the Confederate Army attacked the Union Army at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. That began what is now called the Civil War, or the War between the States. The Civil War lasted 4 years, from 1861 until 1865, when the Confederate Army surrendered. The Civil War ended slavery in the United States and saved the Union, but also destroyed much of the South and killed more Americans than any other war in history. This is the end of Section 2. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 45. What are the 2 major political parties in the United States? The Democratic and Republican parties. The 2 major political parties in the United States are the Democratic and Republican parties. Question 72. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1800s. The Civil War. The United States fought several wars in the 1800s. The 2 mentioned in this lesson are the Mexican-American War and the Civil War. 2 other wars from the 1800s are the War of 1812 and the Spanish-American War. They will be discussed in a later lesson. Question 73. Name the U.S. war between the North and the South. The Civil War. The U.S. war between the North and the South is called the Civil War, or the War between the States. 1800 through the Civil War, Section 3. We will now begin the 3rd section of Lesson 3. Slavery was one problem that led to the Civil War. However, related to slavery were 2 other issues: states' rights and economic reasons. Some people argued that slavery was a matter of states' rights. The Constitution did not outlaw slavery, and the Supreme Court had also already limited the federal government's authority to regulate slavery through the Dred Scott decision. Slavery was also an economic issue because a large part of the Southern economy relied on slaves. Slaves were so important to the economy, they made up from 1/3 to 1/2 of the population in the slave states. And with a new president that did not want slavery in any new territories, many Southerners felt they could no longer remain part of the United States. When the Civil War began, President Lincoln's main concern was preserving the Union. However, Lincoln needed the full support of abolitionists to win the war. After the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln decided to make the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation is one of the most important events of the Civil War. The proclamation was an executive action that freed the approximately 3.5 million slaves in the Confederate States. The proclamation also had clear political purposes. From the start of the Civil War, Lincoln's main concern was preserving the Union. He needed the support of abolitionists to win the war, yet there wasn't universal support for a war which had emancipation as its main goal. Additionally, the British and French had abolished slavery prior to the Civil War, so by freeing the Southern slaves, this helped discourage the countries from recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate country. After the Emancipation Proclamation, abolition, along with saving the Union, became a central goal of the war. The U.S. Constitution includes procedures allowing for changes or additions to it. Such changes or additions are called amendments. After the Civil War, 3 amendments related to slavery were added. Despite the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln didn't actually have the authority to free the slaves. Plus, the proclamation didn't make slavery illegal, free slaves in the border states, or make freed slaves into citizens. Therefore, Lincoln encouraged Congress to adopt an amendment outlawing slavery. After the Civil War, 3 amendments related to slavery were added. First was the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. A few years later, the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to anyone born in the United States. In that way, every freed slave was made a citizen. Lastly, in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave all men, including African American men, the right to vote. Abraham Lincoln did several important things as president. He successfully led the United States through the Civil War, he saved the Union, and he freed the slaves. Lincoln was also the first U.S. president to be assassinated. He was shot by a Southerner 5 days after the Confederate Army surrendered. This is the end of Section 3. We will now practice the related civics questions. Question 4. What is an amendment? A change or addition to the Constitution. An amendment is a change or addition to the Constitution. Question 74. Name one problem that led to the Civil War. Slavery. Slavery is one problem that led to the Civil War. 2 other problems that led to the Civil War were economic reasons and states' rights. Question 75. What was one important thing that Abraham Lincoln did? Freed the slaves. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Abraham Lincoln did many important things as president. He freed the slaves, saved the Union, and led the United States during the Civil War. Question 76. What did the Emancipation Proclamation do? Freed the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the Confederacy, freed slaves in the Confederate States, freed slaves in most Southern states. This is the end of Lesson 3.